This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. At our Military History Night of April the 21st, Lieutenant Colonel Carl Gauthier of the Department of National Defence discussed Canadian military honours and recognition.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patricia Hind-White, and I organize this event. Welcome to RCMI's Virtual Military History Night, Wednesday, April 21st, 2021. This presentation will be videotaped for educational purposes and available for viewing on RCMI YouTube channel. At this time, I would like to extend a sincere thank you to our dedicated RCMI behind-the-scenes team of RCMI President Mike Hall, General Manager Garrett Wright, Sylvia Lau, Event Sales Manager and in-house Zoom expert, Jim Lutz, Events Committee Chair, Eric Morse, Editor of RCMI Members News, Director of Publications, member of RCMI Strategic Studies Committee, and producer of RCMI videos for their strong support and expertise. And also at this time, I would extend a special thank you to RCMI member Tom Doran for suggesting Carl as a presenter. Thank you very much, Tom. A question and answer follows this presentation, and I ask that you mute your mics and hold any questions till that time. The mute button is to the left of the screen. Click it to mute and click to unmute. Our speaker, Lieutenant Colonel Carl Gauthier, MMM CD, was born and raised in Mont-Joli, province of Quebec. He holds a degree in history and began his military career as a cadet instructor following his time as an air cadet. He completed his studies before serving for nearly 5 years as the Wing Heritage Officer of three-wing Bagotville, Quebec, where he contributed to the opening and operation of the Bagotville Air Defense Museum. He has been employed in what is now known as the Directorate of Honours and Recognition at the Department of National Defence in Ottawa since 2002 and has been its director since 2013. In this presentation, our speaker will provide an overview of the origin, creation, and structure and functioning of the modern Canadian military recognition system, highlighting the main orders, decorations, and medals currently awarded to deserving members of the Canadian Armed Forces in recognition of their valor, merit, sacrifice, and service. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, welcome, Carl, and over to you. I'm virtually speaking. The floor is yours.
All right, hopefully everybody can see that, so we can move directly to the next slide. So tonight, I will be speaking to you about the evolution of the military recognition system in Canada. So here's a brief outline of what we will be discussing. So we'll talk about the history first, what happened before the modern system, how the current system evolved. We will touch about the nomination process. I will spend a little bit more time talking about the Order of Military Merit, and then the three main families of decorations for military valor, bravery, and meritorious service. Then we'll talk about casualty recognition, briefly about campaign and service medals, and then, of course, we'll take some time for questions at the end. Moving on to the next slide. So, of course, honors have a very long history. If you look back at other civilizations and countries, we've had honors pretty much for as long as we can remember. They are not necessarily always in the physical form of an order, a decoration, or medal that is wearable as we know them now, but honors have always been part of the tradition. People wanted to recognize certain people, and of course, for most societies, the most highly valued contribution to the society was to put one's life at risk and demonstrate bravery to protect the group or the community itself. And therefore, an example of non-medallic recognition can certainly be found with our First Nations, where they did have recognition well before the French and the English arrived here. Of course, again, not medallic in form, but certainly somebody who distinguished himself in a war could be recognized as a chief. He was given proeminence and respect and authority, but there were also non-medallic, but still physical symbols. For example, some nations use the eagle feather as a token of honor. Others use tattoos as a mark of bravery in the field. And others still use other somewhat gruesome forms of recognition that they were entitled, for example, to hang scalps or even skulls of their defeated enemies at their place of residence. So, the principle was the same, is basically to mark those who have made a significant contribution to the collective good. Now, if we move closer to our days, when the French regime was in charge here in what is now known as Canada, honors already were in existence. And French royal honors were used in those days, and that was primarily, in fact only, the Ordre Royal et Militaire de Saint-Louis, the Cross of Saint Louis, as it was called commonly. And this was an order that had already been in existence for nearly 100 years by the time the French regime ended, and it was granted to approximately 300 Canadians for various good services to New France. And you can see the insignia there on the middle row towards the left of the slide. A number of claims were actually even made after the conquest and granted by the French authorities, and several descendants of recipients of that decoration are still around in Canada today. Of course, later on, it is British honors that came about, and we are certainly much more familiar with them. They were used certainly in much greater numbers from the time of Confederation all the way until the 1960s. So British honors cover different areas. And of course, in terms of the military, certainly the most important one to us is the gallantry in the field area. And if we just go to the next slide temporarily, you can see a little bit the framework of the British gallantry system as it existed at about the end of the First World War, with one slight addition there for the Second World War. So everybody knows about the Victoria Cross, of course, created by Queen Victoria in 1856, retroactive to 1854 to cover all actions in the Crimean War. This was and remains the highest form of recognition in the entire Commonwealth, overranking even the very ancient orders, because again, the value of bravery in combat is always valued as one of the most significant, and that's why the Victoria Cross is at the very top of the order of precedence. As you can see, there are several levels, up to 4 levels, and in the British system, at most levels, these decorations also varied depending which service one belonged to. So you have the Navy on the left, the Army in the middle, and the Air Force on the right. You can see the Victoria Cross, as well as the Just Junior Distinguished Service Order, as well as the Very Junior mentioned in dispatches, are service neutral. So they can be given to people of any service, but certainly all the ones in the middle were confined to a specific service. And not only was the decoration divided by service, but it was also divided by rank, which is very much a product of the society that created them, the Victorian and Edwardian and Georgian society, where class mattered a great deal. And therefore, there are distinct decorations for officers and separate ones for non-commissioned members. So a very identical action by a corporal, for example, would earn them in the field a military medal. The same action by a lieutenant would give them a military cross, and the same thing by a lieutenant colonel would give them the Distinguished Service Order. So it was fairly complicated, but it did work for the British until fairly recently. It's only in 1993, really, that they reformed all of this to simplify it. And in fact, make most all gallantry decorations based on merit alone, and all open to all ranks. And in fact, pretty much all of them, except at level 3, became service neutral as well. You will see that in Canada, we adopted that method as well. So I think everybody's heard about the Victoria Cross, the DSO, the Military Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross. These are things that our veterans earned, in the Boer War, in the First and the Second World War, and even into Korea. And so they are certainly part of our military heritage. And even today, in military units, soldiers will all know the members of their unit that earned the VC, and even the ones who earned DSOs and other members, other decorations like that, would be very well known in the unit. It is part of the regimental tradition or squadron tradition or ship. And of course, it's part of the morale and esprit de corps to have pride in our unit through those that have been recognized for their service with it. So if we go back one slide to the previous one, having chatted a bit about the gallantry aspect, there was also bravery, and distinguished from the former by the fact that it's bravery in the face of danger, but not under enemy fire. And so that would be somebody putting their lives at risk to try to attempt to save somebody else, maybe from drowning, from a house fire, from any kind of very dangerous hazard. And Canadians did earn some of those British decorations, including the George Cross and the George Medal. And before those were created during the Second World War, there was also the Albert Medal and a range of other ones, as well as appointments to the Order of the British Empire for gallantry, which are in fact the very last few British honors that we use all the way into the 1960s for gallantry demonstrated, for example, in the Congo, as well as in a plane crash in Newfoundland in the 1960s. We also have, of course, merit recognition, which in the British system was very much done through the appointment to orders. And in Britain, as you may know, they have a number of different orders. You may have heard of the Order of the Garter, the Order of the Thistle. At one point, but no longer, there was the Order of St. Patrick. And then the more common one, which are less reserved to the aristocracy, but more broadly awarded, you had the Order of the Bath, the Order of St. Michael and St. George, the Royal Victorian Order, which is essentially the Royal Household Order, and of course, the junior and certainly the biggest and most well-known order, the Order of the British Empire. And Canadians were appointed to all of those junior orders, so not the Garter and the Thistle, but certainly for all the others from the 19th century and all the way up to the Korean War, and like I said, in the case of the OBE, into the 1960s. Most of those orders have different levels. For example, the Order of the British Empire has 5 levels, and the 2 top levels of all the multi-level orders carry with them knighthood. So one would become Sir John Smith if one is made a Knight Commander or a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the British Empire, for example. So I'm mentioning this because it's going to become important a little bit later on in this presentation. So people were appointed to orders in order to recognize merit. In a military context, that could be merit, in a supporting role, for example, in all of the logistics, the training, the recruitment, the medical services during wartime, as well as, leadership in operations. The Order of the Bath especially was used to recognize senior leaders that were not maybe necessarily at the tip end of the sword, but were planning and executing campaigns in theater. Moving on then to probably the most well-known parts of honors is campaign and service medals. And of course, those are the ones that we see veterans wearing to recognize service, in the world wars and Korea. And of course, that tradition continues in the Canadian Forces, as we will see later on. Now, these various categories of recognition did not all come at the same time. And we have this impression that this is a very ancient system. But really, the most ancient part of the British or Commonwealth honor system were the orders. So the Order of the Garter dates back to 1348, for example. The Order of the Bath, from 1725 in its current iteration. The Order of St. Michael and St. George, 1818. And of course, the Order of the British Empire was created during the First World War because the demand was so high. in 1917. So orders were certainly the first and most ancient part of the formal recognition system. Gallantry came as a specific form of recognition much later. The idea of orders of chivalry at the very beginning, yes, would probably recognize great gallantry by a knight in combat, and the person could be knighted right there on the battlefield by his sovereign for having distinguished himself on the field of battle. But those medieval traditions quickly morphed as there were less, conflicts of the Middle Age nature, and we moved into the Renaissance and the next few centuries. Orders transformed themselves to be more of a merit-based award, but very much concentrated in one strata, the very top strata of society. It was usually open to mostly the aristocracy and the high-ranking officials for merit, but they were also used quite obviously as tools of patronage by the crown and or the government to secure the loyalty of people. Essentially, one could be knighted on the battlefield and be a knight, period, but belonging to an order of knighthood, that is a society of merit, usually headed by the sovereign, who was the king, was a method for sovereigns to reward, but also to ensure the loyalty of their closest associates. This was a very strong leadership tool to try to mark people with an insignia that they were loyal to you, and there was usually an oath part of the installation service to your sovereign, and to make sure that they remain loyal to you. And so that evolved, of course, with time, and orders eventually morphed from that battlefield or loyalty to the sovereign in a very small sense to the bigger service to the state at the higher level. And eventually, as time moved on, they became more democratically awarded. And certainly from the First World War onwards, that happened even more prominently. The First World War and the Order of British Empire was the first major order to be open to ladies and awarded to people of all levels of society for great war work, where they're ammunition workers, managing hospitals and things of that nature. So it was a bit of a revolutionary method, certainly in the UK, but not elsewhere. The Légion d'honneur in France, for example, when it was created by Napoleon in 1802 and then with the insignia in 1804, certainly was predicated upon it not being reserved to the aristocracy. In fact, all of the royal French orders had been abolished and were banned for that very reason, that it was an elitist, thing reserved for the higher ups. And so Napoleon made sure that for his order to be acceptable and accepted for French society, it had to recognize everything from the great scientist to the soldier to everybody, and so it became an order open to the entire society. So the OBE was not brand new in that field, but certainly was a new venture in terms of British honors, especially at the scale at which it was awarded. So to go back to our point about gallantry being fairly recent, there were the mention in dispatches that were used to acknowledge distinguished service in the field, but these didn't actually have an insignia until after the end of the First World War, actually. It was just a mention. Your name was mentioned in the Gazette by the Commander-in-Chief, either at sea or in the field, as you having made a great contribution to the battle in some way. We had to wait until the Crimean War, again, in 1854, to have the first purely gallantry decoration created, and that was the Distinguished Conduct Medal, followed 2 years later by the Victoria Cross. And then eventually the Navy adopted similar things, and eventually the Air Force followed suit. So really, we're talking about the mid-19th century here, compared to the orders of chivalry dating back centuries. This is a fairly recent innovation. Again, bravery is a bit the same thing. We had, the Edward Medal and the Albert Medal. So they were created the late 19th century. And they were a bit of a hodgepodge at the beginning, and they were really restructured during the Second World War. So again, it's a bit recent. Even when we talk about campaign and service medals, the first campaign medal really awarded to all ranks was the Waterloo Medal. So after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, so and this even was for one specific campaign. We really had to wait until 1847 for the Military General Service Medal and the Naval General Service Medal to be created in that period, recognizing campaign service during the Napoleonic Wars, writ large, that we saw the birth of campaign medals as we know them now. So again, only in the last 150 or 60 years or so. So what we see now as a very ancient and well-established system actually grew in fits based on the needs of the moment. The VC and the DCM were created because of the need that was seen during the Crimean War. A bunch of those decorations we saw before, like the Military Cross, the Military Medal, were needed for the First World War. And the George Cross and the George Medal, in light of the Blitz and a lot of civilians doing extraordinary acts of bravery, were created out of need in the Second World War. So although when we look at it from a distance, it looks like a very ancient stable that it's always been there, it actually grew in fits and starts based on the requirement of the time and evolved over time to become the system that we know now. Now, in Canada, we've had a love-hate relationship with honors over time. So we used certainly those honors that I just mentioned gladly into the First World War. But as the war was grinding on, there was a debate in the UK, which eventually crossed the pond to Canada, where it was discovered that the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, was actually selling honors. And one could essentially purchase a peerage or a knighthood or anything of that sort by a donation to the party in power. And that, of course, did not go down too well. That honors could be bought. It certainly tarnishes their credibility and the respect in the eyes of everyone. There was a huge debate in the UK that led to the Prevention of Abuse of Honors Act. But in Canada, it was also, significant debate. They said if it's happening in the UK, it must be happening here too, because we're using British honors. And there was also a feeling that in Canada, this was not the UK. We were not a very class-oriented society. We were more democratic. We were more open, and these titles and levels and orders were all a thing of the aristocracy. In the beginning, there was a debate, the Nicol debate, by the name of the MP from Kingston who started it. And his intent originally was only to basically prevent the granting of hereditary titles to Canadians, so peerages that can be inherited by the next generation. But, the debate in Parliament took a life of its own, and of course, MPs did not know really what they were talking about, and this is one of those instances where people got really excited, and in the end, the proverbial baby was thrown out with the bathwater, and this resulted, after the Nicol resolution, there was also a report by a special committee that was adopted by the House of Commons, and it became essentially government policy that honors would not be accepted by Canada at all. So it's not just titular honors. It was not just, hereditary honors, but all titular honors, including knighthoods, and even membership in orders, period, depending on how you read the report or the resolution. And in fact, the only thing that was accepted was basically gallantry decorations, things like the Victoria Cross and MC and things of that nature. So essentially in 1919, honors to regular Canadians, like civilians, and even for the military in non-combat situations, came to a halt entirely. Now, the Nicol resolution, neither this nor the adoption of the report from the House of Commons were law. It was basically government policy, which could be overturned at any time. And certainly Bennett, Prime Minister Bennett, in 34, 35, did just that. Said, thank you very much. That was the opinion of the House at that time, but I think we can do honors using the existing system, and they did. And Bennett actually created probably the most balanced and the precursor. It was a pioneer list of honors that included a lot of females, almost parity in the 30% range, female candidates, but also not only people of his party, people of all parties, to having made a broad range of contributions. And this included Sir Frederick Banting, for example, who was knighted with a KBE in the 1934-35 period. So he revised the list, and strangely enough, or maybe not surprisingly, because the list was so good, it was very well received by the media and by the Canadian public. Sadly, of course, giving honors in the middle of an economic depression did not save him at the next election, and he was replaced by Mackenzie King, who came back to power. And Mackenzie King, who was our longest-serving prime minister, as you all know, had a strange phobia of honors, although he ended up the most decorated prime minister in Canadian history, so it was all good when it was for him, but not when it was for others. He's the one who most strenuously opposed British honors, titular or otherwise, who opposed the creation of Canadian honors, or opposed foreign honors being given to Canadians. And yet, like I said, he ended up with a chest full of ribbons himself, especially after the end of the Second World War. And so when he came back to power, he basically turned the tap back off and said, no, we will abide by the 1919 Government of Canada policy, so the tap was turned off. And so it's in that position that we went into the Second World War in 1939, not having any honors at our disposal. Of course, it was quickly reaffirmed that gallantry decorations were quite all right. So VCs and DSOs and things like that started to flow fairly quickly. But that left all of the ones in support completely unrecognized. And people were trying to say, well, they're not titular honors. The spirit of the resolution and the report was to avoid titular honors. So the lower levels, like I mentioned before, only the two top levels of the multi-level orders of chivalry confer knighthood. The lower levels, like the companions of the Order of the Bath and St. Michael and St. George, and the commanders of the Royal Victorian Order and the Order of the British Empire, and the member level and the officer level, do not carry knighthood at all. And so, of course, they consulted the Prime Minister and the Oud and Odd, and it took until 1942, so 3 years into the war, to finally get a green light after he consulted his dead dog through his crystal ball, I think. Finally, he agreed to let Canadians be recognized with the non-titular levels of the British Orders of Chivalry. And so Canadians could receive CBEs and things like that, and many of them did. For civilians, it was a lot more tricky. He hesitated a lot more, and it's only really at the very end of the war that he allowed one list. It was a big list, but like a end of the war list for all the Canadian citizens that were not in the military to be recognized for their contribution to the war effort. And there were, thousands of people who contributed to that. A small portion of them were recognized, but that was the only civil list of honors between 1930s Bennett list and the creation of the Order of Canada in 1967. So, and 1945 came, and of course, Mackenzie King quickly turned the tap off. But even with that Second World War partial solution, it left much to be desired in the sense that our senior-most officers were essentially out of luck. While their British and Australian and New Zealand and South African colleagues were being knighted, for their leadership in battle and preparing campaigns, the top thing that Canadians could get was a companionship in the Order of the Bath, which was usually a thing for brigadiers, not for like 3-star generals. And so it left them really out in the cold, and they were under-recognized, and they took some extra measures, some extreme measures, so one might say, by using the Order of the Companions of Honor, for example, which was not originally designed at all to recognize military service, but they increased the allocation and handed out a couple of those, which were really meant for public service, scientists, and arts, and to a couple of our top generals, like General Crerar and General McNaughton, for example. So that was a little bit odd, but that's all that they could get. The other ones were all shortchanged and ended up with just CBs and CMGs and CBEs. So back into the 1940s and 50s, the tap is off, and then we get into Korea again. Same issue, but it was quickly agreed that we would basically use the same method as the Second World War, and that happened. And Brigadier Rockingham received the CB out of this, and several others received decorations and appointments to the Order of the British Empire in various levels. And of course, as soon as that war was over, the tap was turned off once more. Now, throughout the Second World War and in the decades that followed, the Department of National Defense had been forcefully pushing to have, if we're not going to use British honors to the fullest, then let's create our own. And several proposals were created and never really came to fruition. As you can see at the bottom of this slide, we did create a few things along the years. The first one, which is not really an honor, the Memorial Cross, which is really a memento, was created in 1919 at the end of the First World War to commemorate all the dead of the Great War. The first real Canadian honor created by the King in right of Canada, i.e. on the advice of his Canadian ministers after the Statute of Westminster of 1931, was the RCMP Long Service Medal in 1934. That was followed by the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal, so a campaign medal in 43, and eventually the Canadian Forces Decoration, our Military Long Service Award, in 1949. We also created a very distinct Canadian version of the Korea Medal in 1953. So although it looks very much like the British one, it has the word Canada on it, was created by the Queen on the advice of the Canadian government, struck in silver in Canada, while the British one was actually approved by the King before he died. Of course, doesn't have Canada, and is struck in cupro-nickel in the UK. So although they look alike, same ribbons, very similar design, they are legally two distinct honors. Besides all of those, one thing that was created in 1943 was what was called the Canada Medal. And that was, again, after a lot of, meditation by Mackenzie King. And that was sort of a compromise because we all at DND wanted to have an order, something with several levels. And he wouldn't have any of that. And the compromise was to create a Canada Medal, which was basically like a single campaign, well, not a campaign medal, a merit-based medal, but to be awarded from anything from like a head of state to a private in battle. Of course, it proved entirely impractical. And of course, although the Prime Minister recommended the creation to the King approved it, probably scratching his head, wondering what this was about. Mackenzie King never actually managed to convince himself that he could approve the first list of recipients. So although the medal was approved by the King, a few samples were actually struck. None were actually awarded, ever, because Mackenzie King could not, agree on who should be on the list. So that was a sort of stillborn idea, if you wish. So we find ourselves into the 60s, despite all of the military's requests, with no recognition at all. And in fact, apart from one list at the end of the First World War, and apart from the Bennett couple of lists in 34, 35, there was no civilian recognition of any kind in Canada from 1990 until the centennial. So 50-year window, essentially, where people who helped build modern Canada could not be recognized by the state for their accomplishments. So if we skip up 2 slides, so next slide, and exactly to this point, here we find ourselves on the eve of the centennial. And of course, Prime Minister Pearson is now in power. He has experience with honors because he served during the First World War. He was made an OBE as a diplomat later on. And of course, he's very keen to get Canada its own symbols. And you all know about the long and acrimonious debate that led to the creation of the Canadian flag in 1965. This having been done, he felt that he could now move on to other symbols. And the centennial was perhaps the best opportunity to now finally create a Canadian order that would be, based on the reality of this country and managed by this country alone. So slowly but surely, we sort of pushed aside and stopped using the British honors, even like the few cases of bravery that I mentioned that were used into the 60s. That was quietly stopped as time moved on. And eventually, the Prime Minister was able to convince Cabinet, not without significant hardships, that this was a good idea. Of course, Vincent Massey had been pushing for this idea for years and years and years when he was High Commissioner in London, and of course working with Pearson. So Pearson knew all of the story. And then, of course, when he was Governor General, he tried so hard to get this done. Of course, it wouldn't work then. And then eventually, he was consulted on this, and his idea finally prevailed. Well, not as originally intended, because of course the idea was to have a multi-level order to start with, but Cabinet would not accept that. The only way Pearson could get it to Cabinet was essentially to make only a one-level order. And at the last minute, they added this little add-on they called the Medal of Service to it. So it was essentially like a two-level, but one was really disguised as a medal. But eventually, the Order of Canada was finally created by the Queen on the occasion of the centennial, so in 1967. And that became our national order, and that became the cornerstone of how the honor system has been built since. And so the aim of that order was really to recognize every type of endeavor in Canada in every field of society. And the point of the honors, because the Centennial Medal, as the first Canadian commemorative medal was created in the same year, was really to, highlight Canadian unity and pride, basically encourage people to serve well, create those role models that will inspire others to do great things for their country. What Pearson insisted on is that we should not fall back into the pitfalls of either the British or the French honor system and make it our own. And some of the basic principles that he established and insisted upon are still true today and have really paved the way for many other orders around the world, especially in Australia and New Zealand, who have followed our example to a great extent. But first of all, of course, the Queen, the sovereign, who is going to remain the font of all honors. And it's appropriate today, of course. It is Her Majesty's 95th birthday on this day. So she played a significant role in a growing Canadian honor system. And it's still, of course, very much, the sovereign of our orders and on whose behalf all of our decorations and medals are awarded. Secondly, Pearson, although the creation of honors is certainly a political tool, it's a government policy to whether or not we're going to recognize Canadian, what the honors are going to look like, and what type of merit they're going to recognize. That's government policy. So politicians are involved with that part, especially the Prime Minister. But he wanted to make sure that, unlike in Britain and France, the nomination of the actual recipients was going to be completely insulated from politics. So he essentially abdicated his power to give advice to the Crown in terms of the nomination of people, and granted that to an arm's length independent advisory body. And therefore, this committee, chaired in the case of the Order of Canada by the Chief Justice of Canada, and has a number of eminent citizens in certain fields and representative from the order itself, make their recommendation directly to the Governor-General without going through any minister or politician whatsoever. So that certainly was new, and it certainly is still not the case in the UK and France. And also the fact that the nominations would not come from within the government. They would actually be grassroots nominations. Anybody in Canada could nominate their fellow citizens if they felt they were deserving. And again, that was something that was fairly new. Before, it was basically based on, who you knew and the fact that you were known by the government. And the last one, is probably the most important, is the merit-based principle, is that in Canada, you get honors for what you did and not for who you are alone. Unfortunately, in other countries, it's still very much like that. Some honors go hand in hand with certain jobs or certain statuses. And in Canada, we try to avoid that, as much as possible. There are no ex officio appointments besides, the Governor-General and their spouse, because, the GG is the Chancellor of the Order. But other than that, it's all based on merit, and to make sure that not only politicians are involved in the nomination process, but they're barred from being appointed to the orders while they're in office. And that's for both politicians and sitting judges. So trying to really distance ourselves from the past issues with that. Now, in terms of the structure of the honor system, the Order of Canada was the first part, but it certainly has grown significantly since then. It's now comprises, of course, the three traditional categories: orders, decorations, and medals. So orders are usually given, in the Canadian context at least, for long-term merit. And they are usually divided in several levels, and one can be promoted within the order if further merit has been demonstrated. And the insignia are worn different ways depending on the level that you are at. Decorations, and when you are in order, you're not awarded. And some people use the word you're awarded the Order of Canada, which is not strictly correct because the order is actually the people that make it up. The order is a society of merit. It's a living society of people who deserve and have been admitted in it. The insignia that they wear is an insignia of membership. They're not wearing the Order of Canada, they are in the Order of Canada, and they wear an insignia to denote their membership in it. Decorations and medals are awarded. Decorations are usually recognizing a single achievement or meritorious service over a very specific period of time, while medals recognize a wide array of things from campaign operational service to long service to Crown and Country, and also commemorate, important anniversaries, royal or national. So in terms of the Order of Canada, as you may know, I mentioned before, was created in 1967 with one level, companion, and with a medal of service attached. But quickly it was realized this was not entirely practical. And then in 1972, it was reformed to the three levels that we know now of companion, officer. So all those that had the medal of service were automatically made officers of the order, and then the level of member was added at the bottom. And so that was the start of the expansion of the honor system. If we move to the next slide, we see the pyramid of honors. And this illustrates how, in an honor system, you have, of course, the things at the top are the rarest, the most difficult to attain. Well, as you go down the pyramid, even within the national honors, which is the highest, the lighter part, yellow part at the top, as you go down, you can be more generous in the bestowal of the honor, and they're more easily attainable. And then, of course, under national honors, you have departmental awards, like we have the CDS commendation and things like that, and letters of appreciation, points on your annual appraisal, and then down to verbal praise and a good old handshake. Recognition is not limited to orders, decorations, and medals. Honors from the Crown certainly are the most at the pinnacle, quite literally here, of the recognition system. But there are many ways to recognize people, and that's a visual illustration of that. Now, if we move to the next slide, you can see the military recognition framework as it now appears, and you will see that we cover all the fields there, and we'll talk about the individual decorations shortly. Can we move to the next slide, please? There we go. So you can see here, again, the levels, similar table to the previous, which covered only gallantry. Here, this one covers military valor, our modern term for gallantry, on the left-hand side column. The middle one is bravery, so not in combat. And then the final one is merit. And in the military context, of course, at the top level, we've got the Victoria Cross still, Cross of Valour, the Order of Military Merit, and then you've got level 2, level 3, the mentioned dispatches, and the departmental awards at the bottom. So, as you can see, and I will mention this a bit later as well, in terms of military valor decorations or bravery decorations, they are blind to the service and blind to the rank. So it's the action that determines the level of recognition, and not the uniform you're wearing or the rank that you have. Moving on to the next slide, we have a brief overview of the nomination process. So anybody can initiate a nomination throughout the chain of command, but of course the CO of the individual has to support it. Now, the nomination is going to make its way to the various levels of the chain of command. At any point in there, it can be upgraded, downgraded, changed to a different category of honor, or simply not supported and end there. It makes eventually its way to the top commander of a level, say the commander of the Navy or the Army, and then it comes to us at DHNR. Our job is to make sure that, one, the nomination meets the criteria that is stated in regulations. Two, it is in line with the precedents for that same honor. And three, where appropriate, i.e. for deployed operations, it is within the allocations or quotas that are allocated for each operation and rotation in theater. If the three answers are yes, as appropriate, then it moves to the next level. So we have either the Advisory Council for the Order of Military Merit or the Canadian Forces Decorations Advisory Committee that look at these higher honors nomination. The MID and departmental awards don't go through there. We send them straight from the DHNR to the CDS, and on we go. But for anything MSM to VC, essentially, it all goes through those committees. So either ORMM Council or the Decorations Committee. And both of those are chaired by the CDS. And the members around the table are all 3 stars, well, mostly 3 stars, I should say. There's a couple of 2 stars there, and a representative of the Governor General. They will make their recommendation through the Chief of the Defense Staff to the Governor General, who will approve on behalf of the Queen. And then as soon as we're informed of the approval, of course, the command will have a certain amount of time to inform the recipients before a message comes out to announce the award. And eventually, of course, the Governor General will proceed with a formal investiture for those honors, either at Rideau Hall or the Citadel, and sometimes in other locations. Of course, this is sort of on hold now because we haven't had any investitures in over a year. So we're now moving to virtual investitures, which is a whole new world. Moving on to the next slide, and just a little bit more time talking about the Order of Military Merit. So we have to talk a bit more about the Order of Canada before we get there, because the intent of the Order of Canada was a little bit like the Legion of Honor, to be an order for the nation. Whether the recipient is in uniform or not was to be irrelevant. And so that order, which was created after much lobbying by the Department of National Defense, we wanted to be part of it. But it quickly became obvious with the first few lists that apart from a few highly distinguished Second World War generals, there was not going to be any room for regular military people on the Order of Canada lists. Like I said, there was 50 years worth of deserving Canadians of every field fighting for a few appointments to the Order of Canada every year. The chances of, Sergeant Smith or Major Brown to make it to the list was next to nil, and in fact was nil, hence the lists. And so pretty much immediately after the creation of the Order of Canada, DND started to lobby again, this time for its own order, to have something that would be similar to the Order of Canada, but just for the Canadian Armed Forces. And that's what happened in 1972. So it took still 5 years to get that figured out, at the same time as they were figuring out the restructuring of the Order of Canada. So they recreated in 72 the Order of Canada, restructured it into 3 levels, created a 3-level Order of Military Merit, created 3 levels of decorations for bravery that we will mention later on. And there you have a fuller system. You recognize achievement at the national level in all fields on the civilian side, military merit, and then bravery by anyone in Canada, whether in uniform or not. So the system really started to grow. The order, again, in 3 levels: commander, always reserved for general and flag officers; the level of officer, reserved for senior officers; and the level of member for every other member of the Canadian Armed Forces, so from private to captain inclusive. And it is possible for people to be promoted through the order, usually when you attain a higher rank and a higher level of responsibility. Most of the promotions we see are from officer to commander, when people become, they were appointed, say, as a lieutenant colonel, and then they will be made a commander when they're a major general or a lieutenant general or something like that. But there have been promotions also from M to O, especially earlier in the order. We've had some issues with the order where, although at the beginning it was very much along the intent that we're going to recognize people at every level of rank for various types of recognition of contribution, and we sort of felt, without it being intentional, with time, it slowly drifted back to the old ways we were trying to avoid in the first place, where the appointments very much concentrated in a couple of small pockets within the forces. So top generals and colonels and a bunch of chief warrant officers. And anybody below mass warrant officer was pretty much out of luck. Same thing for captains and lieutenants, which was not the case at all in the first few lists. You had corporals and sergeants and captains and lieutenants in the first lists of the Order of Military Merit, but we drifted away from that. And we've been trying for the last over a decade now to try and bring back a more balanced approach. And we now have every year 30% of the MMMs going to warrant officers and below. We have, a good representation in terms of languages, a better representation of the reserve. We are also getting a much better representation of female recipients that is in line with their representation in the CAF population. So we're also including cadet instructors, Canadian Rangers, who were excluded before. So we're doing a much better job at that, but there's still some ways to go to make sure that the order remains relevant to the people that are concerned with it, to the military. Honors are very nice to say thank you to people, but the state's objective is not all altruistic. The state really, by recognizing people, is trying to create role models that embody the values that the state wishes to promote. And the point is to try to encourage others to work. They will hope, either consciously or subconsciously, that if they work hard enough, like those other people who've been recognized, they too can be recognized. You've all heard of the Maslow pyramid of needs. The need for recognition, for distinction, is certainly a human need. Once you put a roof over your head and you're fed and all that, as you go down the pyramid, it's important to be recognized. And we use that human need to try to motivate people to do great things. But again, it's going to work only if people think they can attain it. If you compare with the carrot and stick thing, Her Majesty's Prison Service is the stick and the honor system is the carrot. Now, the donkey has to know what the carrot tastes like to be tempted by it. So, it has to be accessible. And if it's only limited to colonels and generals and chief warrant officers, well, the sergeant is not likely to be motivated by it. So we have to make sure that we, spread the love a little bit so that we recognize nice people and have role models at every rank level so that we can properly motivate. People will think, I can actually make this. I can get there. So work is needed. And it's a very fine balance between recognizing enough to make sure that it is a worthy and attainable goal, but not recognizing too much that you eventually dilute the value of the honor itself. And so the limit here is that the Order of Military Merit is only given to 0.1% of the CAF strength in any year. So right now it's about 110 recipients. So it's basically 1 per 1,000 CAF members that is appointed to the order in every year. So it's, fairly rare. And the Order of Canada is even rarer when you look at about 220 appointments out of 37 million people. It's very, very small. So the rarity certainly is there. So that's a very brief overview of the Order of Military Merit. Moving on to the decorations, if we go to the next slide. I'm just looking at the time here. Yes, I think I'll have to speed up a little bit. In terms of military valor decorations, we were supposed to be still using the original Victoria Cross. It was sort of left in limbo. After Korea, we were not really at war. We were doing the peacekeeping thing. And when the question came up, politicians were they were still available in theory, like VC and DSO and things like that. But, really, the Prime Minister Trudeau the first mentioned at one point, really we should be recognizing Canadians with Canadian honors. And left it at that. And certainly the Legion and a lot of organizations were not very pleased with that. It was a sort of a wishy-washy answer. And when Mulroney became Prime Minister, he was pressed on the same issue. And he eventually promised to the Legion that, if we create Canadian decorations for gallantry, the Victoria Cross would be retained as the top. So either not knowing or ignoring the Prime Minister's promise, the bureaucrat at DND worked on a proposal that was being sped up now because of the Gulf War. There had been no need since Korea because we'd been doing peacekeeping. There was no armed enemy. But all of a sudden, we find ourselves in the Gulf War. And at the beginning, of course, we thought we would be, in significant combat and that we might have acts that would deserve VCs and things of that nature. And so we pushed forward with a creation of the military valor decorations. And the plan was to include 3 brand new decorations, no reference to the Victoria Cross at all. It had a Cross of Canada. It had various names over time, and then 2 other levels below it. So when that became public, it was leaked to the media in early 1991. As we're getting into the combat phase of the Gulf War, of course, the thing blew up. Like the Legion burst the gasket, and the Monarchist League was all over this, and a whole bunch of other groups and parliamentarians. Everybody was incensed by this idea that the Victoria Cross was going to be let go, and we're going to create brand new, decorations. So of course, the government tried to let it blow over and held the line for a little while. During which, of course, the Gulf War started and ended very quickly. And we didn't have the combat that we expected. So that idea sort of simmered for a while, and eventually the government gave direction that the proposal should be reviewed with a view to keeping the VC at the top. And that's what was done in 1993. So the Gulf War was long over. We created the 3 levels of decoration with a Canadian version of the VC at the top, and then a star of military valor and a medal of military valor, very much inspired by 1972 bravery decoration that we'll see in a minute. And so they've been created with the 3 levels like that, and as well as the mentioned in dispatches, which had been created at the time of the Gulf War, that one, in 1991, to be basically a Canadian equivalent of the British mentioned in dispatches as essentially a 4th level of gallantry decoration. So the criteria for those is that our troops have to be in combat against an armed enemy recognized as such by Canada. And that's why we didn't use them in peacekeeping. We could have used them in the Gulf War. And then when we went to combat again, it was in Afghanistan, and we did use them in Afghanistan. So, of course, as I mentioned before, rank and service neutral. Limit is 1 per 250 personnel under command for every 6 months in the theater of operation. So 1 per 250 is fairly limited. MID is 1% usually in an active war theater. And of course, the awards have been made. We've awarded 20 stars of military valor during the campaign, as well as 89 medals of military valor. And so far, since 1991, we've awarded, or we've mentioned in dispatches, about 400 people, 311 of those in Afghanistan. So, as you know, it was a fairly long and intense campaign. We had about 40,000 CAF members serve during 13 years in a campaign which saw a whole lot of combat. And when you read the citations for the recipients of the stars, the medals, and the MIDs, they're all very impressive. If we move to the next slide, we can see a little bit the equivalent of the previous British slide on gallantry recognition, but showing the Canadian, and on the right-hand side column, you see what it replaced. So VC, the star, which replaces all the level 2 British decorations, so the DSO, the DCM, and the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal for the Navy and the Air Force. The level 3, which replaces all those service-specific decorations for officers and men. And then the MID is the same. And we also use the departmental commendations as extra levels. Moving on to the next slide, we're going into the bravery decorations. So like I mentioned at the beginning, the Order of Canada, when it was created in 1967, had 1 level companion. It had a Medal of Service, which was essentially a disguised 2nd level. It also had a Medal of Courage attached to it. And that was an attempt at having decorations, Canadian bravery decorations. The trouble, of course, it was 1 level. And it quickly became obvious to the committees involved that there's no way you can recognize all types of bravery with 1 level. So although it was created, it was never awarded. Nobody could ever agree. It didn't make any sense. And so when the Order of Canada was restructured in 72, the OMM was created, they also created the Canadian decorations for bravery in 3 levels. And that made a lot more sense. The Cross of Valor, so ranking right immediately with the Victoria Cross, the Star of Courage, and of course the Medal of Bravery. And the push for this, in great part, was related to the Kootenay incident. In 1969, there was a tragic accident at sea where there was a huge explosion in the engine room of HMCS Kootenay, and several members of the crew acted very bravely during that. And that certainly pushed the government to, get the act together and create those decorations. And several of the first decorations, including 2 of the Crosses of Valor, posthumous ones, were to members of the Kootenay crew. And so far, we've awarded 20 Crosses of Valor, including several to CAF members. There have been 463 stars and about 3,300 medals. And those are awarded to any Canadian citizen, military or not, that basically put their lives in danger in order to save somebody's life or protect somebody from danger. Again, jumping in a fast-flowing river to save somebody from drowning and running into a burning house. There's been a lot. And the gentleman that you see there on the right is Corporal, now Chief Warrant Officer Mitchell, who is one of the last 2 recipient of the Cross of Valor for a very daring parachute rescue in the middle of the night in the Arctic Ocean. And you can see that he's also been made a member of the Order of Military Merit, just hanging there, has received also the Military Service Medal for good measure. So a very highly distinguished CAF member right there. Moving on to the next slide, we have the Military Service decorations. As I mentioned, the British recognize merit with appointments to orders. In Canada, we decided to recognize merit in the short term with decorations. So long-term merit is orders, short-term merit is with either the Military Service Cross or the Military Service Medal. Can we go to the next slide, please? There we go. So the cross was created in '84 first, and it was alone just in the military at the beginning. And it was discovered that it was not flexible enough. Originally, it was basically to be an in-between between appointment to the Order of Military Merit and the award of the Chief of the Defense Staff Commendation, which had been created in 1974. There were people saying that, okay, the CDS commendation is not quite enough, but the Order of Military is a bit too much. And so the MSC was created. Before then, we used the Order of Military Merit sometimes to recognize single actions. The most obvious example of that is those Canadian military personnel involved with the Canadian caper, the Tehran hostage crisis in 1979. There's two or three military members who were appointed as MMMs for their contribution to that episode. So in '84, we created the cross, and seeing the lack of flexibility, in 1991, a medal was created, and a whole new civil division was created to both decorations at the cross and the medal level. So these recognize essentially short-term merit. So be they a single action on one day, like distinguished service during a search and rescue flight, to leadership during an operation, a 6-month deployment, to excellence in service during a whole posting, for example. So they're widely used and in the military, successfully used. We've awarded so far about 270 crosses and over about 1,040 military service medals. And as you can see, the group that's on display right there in the middle has 2 bars on it. That was the very first person. That was Colonel Saint-Cyr, who was the first Canadian to receive an MSM with 2 bars, which is the equivalent of 3 MSMs, if you wish. And there now we have 6 people who've got the MSC and a bar, so 2 MSCs, and about 25 that have received the MSM with 1 bar. There's now 2 that have the MSM with 2 bars. So some very interesting combinations there. The person at the far right, of course, is Captain Goddard, the first Canadian female to be killed in combat. And she was awarded a posthumous MSM for her leadership and distinction during her tour. And the chap at the bottom, Captain Aaron, was receiving, and you can see hanging, well, maybe it's not very clear, but he received both the MSC and the MSM on the same investiture, and these were his first 2 medals. That's a pretty good way to start a group of medals as a pilot. So for 2 distinct air missions, he received both decorations at the same investiture, and he didn't even have a CD yet. So that was pretty impressive to see. Moving on very quickly. Next slide, we have a brief overview of departmental awards. The CDS commendation, like I said, created in '74. A command level one was created in '95, and we also have the Medallion for Distinguished Service for civilians primarily. Next slide, we have casualty recognition. This goes back a long, long way. If we look at the Memorial Cross, it goes back to 1919. We mentioned it briefly, and we've used this for both World Wars, Korea, peacekeeping missions, and we've modernized it greatly during Afghanistan to make it more in line with modern family and the concept of modern service. We've also reactivated the Memorial Scroll, which was a British memorial from the First World War. We've reactivated that in 2009. The Memorial Bar, which was a Canadian initiative from the Second World War, that we've restored. The Sacrifice Medal, of course, was created in 2008, and launched in 2009 to recognize those wounded in combat against a hostile action. But it's also awarded posthumously to anybody who dies as a result of service after 2001. And of course, we've added to this in 2012 the Memorial Ribbon for those members of the family, especially children, that may not receive the Memorial Cross. So we now have a fairly comprehensive memorial package to recognize our fallen and the loss of their families and friends. The next slide has a very brief overview of medals. Like I mentioned, they can recognize service in a campaign or an operation. These are the ones we associate with veterans. And here you have some modern ones, the General Campaign Star on the left, the Operational Service Medal with the Haiti ribbon in this case, the Special Service Medal with the NATO bar. Then we have medals that commemorate special anniversaries, like the anniversaries of Confederation or Jubilees and coronations. This is the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, the last such medal. Unfortunately, there was no medal for the 150th anniversary of Canada, and there won't be one for the Platinum Jubilee. So the tradition has now apparently ended. And then, of course, there's medals to recognize long service and good conduct. Interestingly enough, this Canadian Forces decoration is not really a medal, it's a decoration, and that's why it comes with letters after your name, but it still is a long service honor. But there are long service medals for the police and various protected services as well. So moving on to the next slide, which is the last one, is the questions. I think I've taken my 45 minutes and then some. So we will pause there to take some of your questions. I'm sorry I had to speed up at the end. As you can see, the system is fairly comprehensive, and trying to cover it with any substance in a short amount of time is a bit of a challenge. Before we open to the floor for questions, so one question was sent by email just before the presentation started regarding foreign honors to Canadians and how those are managed. What's the policy for those? And there was a story about some Canadian soldiers receiving foreign decorations during the Second World War, and they needed permission. And that is still the case. Honors emanate from the head of state, as I mentioned, from the Queen, and they've always been a symbol of sovereignty. And it always has been a tricky thing for sovereigns to allow their subjects to receive honors from different sovereigns. There was an issue of loyalty there. If you go back to the early orders of knighthood, as I mentioned, when you became a member of the order, you had to swear allegiance to the sovereign of the order. So if you're a foreigner, say you're British, you're English, and you're going to accept an order from the French king and swear allegiance to the French king, your king is not going to like that very much. And so there was this understanding very early on that in order to accept a foreign honor, you had to receive permission from your own sovereign. Now, of course, this has been modernized over time, but it still stands that any Canadian citizen today who is offered an order, a decoration, or medal by a foreign nation, it must be approved through the diplomatic channels beforehand. So the foreign country is supposed to make the request through their embassy, through Global Affairs Canada, to the Chancellery of Honors. It goes to the Government Honors Policy Subcommittee. They vote on it. And then the answer goes back. And if it's yes, then the country can give the honor. There are some criteria. In Canada, to be accepted, the honor has to come from a head of state. So our honors from the Queen, we're going to only accept honors that come from a head of state, so either a sovereign or a president. We don't accept lower honors like departmental awards and association awards and things like that. The honor cannot carry a title. If we don't accept titles for Canadians from our own system, we're not going to accept from foreign ones. And they have to be, in line with, not be contrary to public interest and things like that. But generally speaking, the main rules are, is it from a head of state? It doesn't have a title. It's not part of your regular job, like it's during a state visit where the president of country X, you distribute these things as essentially diplomatic gifts. We don't accept those. Otherwise, it can be accepted. When the government approves a foreign honor to a Canadian citizen, the name and the award is published in the Canada Gazette, and that means that it can be mounted and worn with official Canadian medals. So that's the rule, and I hope that answers the question to the person who asked it in the first place. If not, I'm happy to provide further clarification. So do we have questions from the floor? Is everybody asleep out there?
If anybody has any questions, now is your time.
Hello, yes, I put a question in the chat regarding the Order of Merit. Can you see that, Pat?
Hold on, let's see.
I'm afraid I can't see it, so.
Who is speaking again?
My name is Gregory Lee. I'll read the question.
The Order of Merit has been re-added to the Canadian Honours a few years back. Why has the Companion of Honour not been added? Prime Minister Chrétien, General de Castellane, etc. have been awarded it in the recent past.
Right, very good question. In fact, Prime Minister Chrétien was made a member of the Order of Merit, not of the Companions of Honor. But you're right about General de Castellane and a few others, like the famous historian, oh God, her name is eluding me now, who wrote Paris 1919, has been made a Companion of Honor as well. It'll come back to me. That's right. Margaret Macmillan has been made a CH. So the trick is that the Order of Merit, which was created by King Edward VII on the occasion of his coronation in 1902, is within the personal gift of the sovereign, just like the Royal Victorian Order. While the Order of the Companions of Honor, which was created in 1917, is awarded on the advice of the government. Therefore, this is strictly speaking a British government honor, if you wish, while the Order of Merit can be seen as a Commonwealth-wide honor directly from the sovereign. So as Queen of Canada, the Queen can appoint Canadians to the OM without reference to the British government at all, while the CH comes from the British government, which makes it a Commonwealth or foreign honor. So those who've been appointed to the CH have to wear it as a Commonwealth honor. So poor General de Chastelain has, his letters are CC, CMM, CD, CH, and he has to wear it in that sequence. While the Order of Merit, and the only Canadian member now is the former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Of course, the OM being so rare, only 24 members worldwide, the OM comes even before the CC, right after the VC and the Cross of Valour. And he's only the fourth Canadian ever to receive it, the other three having been, Prime Minister Mackenzie King, and that's one of those that he accepted, Prime Minister Pearson, as well as Dr. Penfield. Other questions?
There's a couple more here. One from David Collins. Thank you for this. But why is the Order of Canada such a limited order in terms of numbers in comparison with, for example, the Order of the BE with question mark? Even the CMM is more generously granted, especially at the higher rank level.
Right. It's true, like I mentioned, that the Order of Canada is extremely limited in number still. There was a great fear at the beginning in 67 that people were going to, have a very hesitant reaction to the reintroduction of honors in Canada. And the last thing they wanted is to have very long lists, of hundreds of people, and the impression that really it was going to be devalued very quickly. Now, the numbers have increased steadily over the years. They've increased the allocation every year. Of course, the three levels have helped with that tremendously, but the numbers are still extremely conservative. There are still proposals now to broaden the membership still, but you will hear in the media some people saying that it's awarded too generously. Of course, those people don't compare with the Order of British Empire or the Légion d'honneur or any order around the world, because we're still extremely conservative in number. In terms of the CMM and the CC, it's true that the CC is a small number because it's not only limited to a number every year, but it's limited in overall membership. There cannot be more than 165 alive at any one time, and a maximum of 15 can be given in every year, which there is never 15 given in a year. Usually it's more like a handful. It's like 3, 4, 5 maybe. And in terms of CMM, we get about 5 a year based on the proportions, because out of, I said 0.1% of the CF strength, which gives us, say, 110, that number is then divided between 5% of CMM, 20% of OMMs, and then the balance is all MMMs. So that gives us these days about 5 CMMs a year, which, seems a bit more generous, certainly, by comparison of scale with the Order of Canada. But and the Order of Canada has not even fully used their allocation in recent years, which is, I can't understand that, but it's not fully used yet.
All right, I have a couple more questions from Cam Ross. How many Canadian Victoria Crosses have been awarded?
Right, Canadian Victoria Crosses, none of those have been awarded. Of course, Canadians have earned the original Victoria Cross. Depending on how you count it, it's anywhere from 81 to 103 or something like that. But certainly under Canadian command, 81 Canadians earned a VC. The last ones, the last 16 ones were during the Second World War. We haven't had any in Korea, and we haven't had any in Afghanistan. And some people criticize that and question that, and still do. and some people say, oh, it's because they didn't want to award one or something like that, which is not the case at all. The Victoria Cross has an extremely high bar. And we did a review because of all these rumors, and even within the CF, there was an impression that maybe we'd become more generous with military valor decorations as the Afghan campaign, wore on. So General Natinchuk, who was the Chief of Defense Staff at the time in 2012, ordered a full review of this. And we relooked, and we, basically a committee of general officers that was specially made up for this, relooked at all of the stars of military valor, all 20 files, the full files, and in detail, and compared them together, compared them with the criteria, compared them also with precedents, British precedents and others, to make sure that we had done the right thing. And the conclusion was that we had actually been surprisingly consistent across time. It's just that we faced more combat, of course, towards the end when we moved down to Kandahar. And that the number of awards altogether were very much in line with what we did in Korea and very much in line with what the Commonwealth partners had done. Of course, the British did award VCs and the Australians and the New Zealanders in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And we did not. But when we took the comparison, we left aside the New Zealanders and the Australians because, like us, they were new at this game. We took the British ones and not the old ones like First World War, because VCs were essentially easier to earn back then because they didn't have all of those intermediary awards, in the Boer War, for example. So you have to consider in the modern ones. So we looked at the ones from the Vietnam, because Australians did earn VCs in Vietnam, to the Falklands, to the British ones in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what we found is that there were two factors in modern VCs, most of which are posthumous, that needed to be achieved. It's either one who would single-handedly charge the enemy against overwhelming odds, or somebody who would willingly and intentionally make themselves the target of the enemy in order to relieve pressure from their colleagues. And while certainly our Star of Military Valor recipients have demonstrated tremendous gallantry and earned their star fair and square, none of them actually passed that very high bar. So it's not that we didn't want to award one, it's because none of them actually met that very high standard in comparison with the criteria and the precedents. And that's why there was not one award. And if we have one in Iraq tomorrow that meets the criteria, or another conflict in the future, it will be awarded. I can assure you that.
Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sir, my name is Derek Mooney. I'm a retired major, and I did my my last tour in 2015 over in Kuwait and Iraq, and there's sort of some discussion ongoing with the awards, honors, and recognition of such with Ottawa about entitlements. I was going to ask you, I'm currently now working as a civilian contractor with the Canadian Joint Warfare Center out of Ottawa. And I was going to ask you if you would mind if I contact you on the D1 to outline the circumstance and see if you might be able to look into it for me. Over.
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure what the question is exactly, because the recognition for service in Kuwait and Iraq is pretty clear. Those who serve in Kuwait and other support locations like Qatar and places like that get the General Service Medal with the Expedition Ribbon. Those who serve in or over Iraq get the General Campaign Star with the Expedition Ribbon. And those that spend time on both sides, of course, can count times for both. But if they qualify for both within 6 months, they only get the higher award, so the GCS. You cannot get both within 6 months. But I'm not aware of any policy.
I was there for 9 months, and there's some question on qualification of both. And yeah, I did over the 30-day mark in Iraq, and there was somebody had informed me that the qualification was then lowered to 14 days, and somebody else informed me that if I did the 14 days, either at the beginning of the tour or the end of the tour, and still had 180 days in Iraq and over 14 days consecutive 180 days in Kuwait, and then over 14 days consecutive in Iraq, then there would be an entitlement for both. Is that true?
Well, it all depends on the personal circumstances, because the trick is that there has to be 6 months between the qualification for both. So if you're a flyer, for example, you fly in and out,
Yeah.
you're probably going to qualify for both within a very short amount of time. If you fly every other day, probably at day 45, you will have earned both the GCS and the General Service Medal, but the qualifying dates are only, 2, 3, 4 weeks apart. That means you can only get the top one. But again, it depends on the individual circumstances of the person, how long you were in theater for, and all of that stuff. So we would have to look at the case to tell for sure. But you're right as well that we reduced the time criteria for the GCS from 30 to 14 days, and for the GSM from 30 to 21 days, in order to make those more flexible in light of the modern deployment tempos and stuff. But
Right.
yeah, sure, you can send me your old service number and things, and we can look at how it framed. Were you a flyer at all, or you were on the ground?
No. I was infantry, but I was in the 3-star headquarters in Kuwait. I was the chief assessments for the Iraqi army and the Kurdish forces. So
Okay.
a lot of
Yeah,
my
so we'll
time,
probably,
a lot of my time was spent up in Iraq working with my people up there. So I
okay.
have
Well,
the
this is a
requisite
very
qualifications.
individual case. We can discuss that separately. But yeah, we would need to sort out all of the trips, and it can be pretty complicated. But anyway,
Yeah.
we can sort that out separately.
The thing that really complicates it is that everything on the networks that we were doing there was American secret. So it was on CIPRA network and couldn't get anything off. I've got some attestations, but couldn't really get anything off of there to put my timelines in. So anyway, I'll drop you a line on the D1 and see what comes of it. Over.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. We've got, a few more questions. Time is running out, but I guess we can extend it a little bit, as we did start a little bit late. I have a question here from James Douglas. How many honors have been withdrawn besides Al Eagleson?
Well, honors is a very broad term. If you're talking about the Order of Canada specifically, there have been quite a few. I think they're at 7 or something like that now. Another one was David Haneke. You may remember him. So there have been a few. I don't have the exact number. I know that for the Order of Military Merit, we just did our 3rd termination now. It was published in the Canada Gazette a couple of weekends ago. The Order of Police Merit has had a couple as well. So there are a few terminations, and there are a few files that are brewing as well. So yeah, it's unfortunate. But when you are in an order, it's a society of merit, and you breach the concept of honor, you're held to a higher standard than regular citizens. If you do something silly as a member of one of those orders of the Queen, you can be kicked out, or you can resign of your own if you wish. And some people have resigned, and a few of those resignations would have turned into terminations if the people had not taken the honorable way out. But yes, in fact, the 3 terminations we've had in the Order of Military Merit were all linked to the unlawful wear of decorations and insignia. So people that put up medals and badges they're not supposed to have. So we treat that fairly severely because it goes against the ethos of the military. So yes, there have been a few in the Order of Canada. I could pull it up, but it may take a little while. But there've been, I think it's 5 or 7 or somewhere around there.
I've got one, I'm not sure. Can you comment on the fact that no Victoria Cross in Afghanistan, New Zealand, with a much smaller army, has awarded one? Australia 1, Britain 2 or 3?
Yeah, well, I think that question is probably from before.
I thought it's.
Yeah, I explained all of this.
Yeah. I think that's about it. I don't think there's any. There's just one, I think. Oh. This chap from Lee Walsh, he's currently doing some research on a missing Canadian RCAF airman, Battle of Britain veteran that crashed and remains missing near Mont Joly. I think he'd like you to get in touch with him. I can probably, if I don't know how he wants to get in touch with you in Ottawa. Is there any, can you comment on that?
I'm sorry, it was something about a plane crash?
Yes, I said, from Lee Walsh, she's the Canadian Aviation Historical Society. I am currently doing research on a missing Canadian RCAF airman, Battle of Britain veteran, that crashed and remains missing near Mont Joly.
Oh, Mont Joly is where I was born and grew up. And we had the 9th Bombing and Gunnery School there. So if he was a Battle of Britain pilot, he was probably an instructor there. And several people were lost during training for various accidents and things. So, I'm not aware of that specific story, but if he wants to get in touch with me, you can send in my email and we'll go from there. But the story doesn't ring a bell. That's individual story.
All right, fine. Well, we'll do that. Let's see now, anybody else? From James Douglas. What would you add to the honors and decorations? I would not want us to be like the Americans who give medals for anything, but are there any gaps?
Yes, I do believe that there's still a couple of gaps, and I would say that these concern mostly the civil service. Again, the Order of Canada was supposed to recognize all Canadians, and one would have believed that the civil service, which is the biggest workforce in the country, about 325,000 people, depending on who you count exactly, would get their fair share of that, but they certainly have not. Like the civil servants on the list, except for retiring or retired clerks of the Privy Council, are extremely rare. And I think that workforce serving the Crown and the Government of Canada is not being recognized the way it should, both in terms of merit and in terms of long service. Those nice awards that after so many years you can get like a presswood plaque with a fake signature of the Prime Minister on it or some watch or something. That's very nice, but it's not like an honor from a crown. So I think there would be room for a public service medal, which would be like a 20-year service as a public servant with bars every 10 years thereafter, and possibly for an order of the public service, which could be called the Order of the Legion of Service or something like that in 3 levels. But that should only be entertained if first the protective services were cleared up, because as you know, we have the OMM, and in 2000 they added the Order of Merit to the police forces. But since then, of course, the firefighters and a bunch of the other ones are saying, well, what about us? And you don't want to have 7 different orders, one for the military, one for the police, the fire, the correction services, the Coast Guard. It becomes a bit ridiculous. Our recommendation has been to reform the Order of Military Merit, make it a Canadian Order of Merit with a military division and a civil division. And the military division would be the OMM as we know it now, and the civil division would be open to all protective services, so that all of those Canadians that serve Canadians in a potentially life-threatening job that qualify for the exemplary service medals, the police medals, would be eligible for that. And then the Legion of Service would be for civil servants that are not in, very dangerous situations. Other than that, I think with the creation now of the Polar Medal, of the Volunteer Medal, which was long awaited, I think the system is pretty well-rounded. So there's a bit of tweaking to do with this OMPF and for the civil service, but other than that, I think our system is fairly comprehensive.
I think there's probably one of the last questions here from Peter Moon. Where is it? Why does the Order of Military Merit not have a citation explaining why it was awarded? Why does the Order of Military Merit not have a citation explaining why it was awarded?
It's true. Traditionally, there has not been a citation with the OMM because it's awarded for essentially a career of long and distinguished service in the military where you stood out among your peers. And that's usually a succession of postings and overseas deployments and command positions or leadership positions for NCMs. At one point, somebody, in fact, Governor General Clarkson insisted that we have citations. And the commands came up with the most outrageous things. There's a major general who was made a CMM, and one of his achievements, it was like a point form thing, was to, get a second language certification, and we all sort of glazed over. So it's been decided that it was probably better to respect the original tradition, is that the members are appointed for a long and distinguished military career, showing professionalism in the field of arms, over a long term, wearing the uniform for crown and country, but not have individual citations. People are of two minds of this, but certainly that has been the practice, except for that couple of years during Clarkson, and that was not a very happy experience, I have to say.
Well, I think this likely be the last question. It's rather an odd one, but it's from James Douglas. I am really impressed by your rationale for medals and decorations, very important. Now, would you comment on the American system where getting out of bed 20 days in a row gets you a medal? That's the question.
Yes, well, every country has a different honor system. And certainly our system and most of the Commonwealth system are strikingly different from the American practice. And in fact, until the Second World War and even the few years after that, the American system was fairly conservative in terms of numbers and the types of things they recognize. The trick is that they use their honor system to recognize really everything from volunteering for the force, for serving within the forces when there's an international crisis, for passing courses and achieving certain milestones in one's career. When you look at the racks of ribbons, a sergeant can have like 24 ribbons. You have to realize that not all of those ribbons correspond to actual medals. Many of those ribbons are just ribbons to say, okay, qualified for this, or achieved top cadet on the course of whatever, airman in a year type of thing, which for us would translate into commendations or sometime a handshake. But their system has been built differently, that it's much broader and recognized a lot more. But it's true that they're also more generous in the sense that everybody who deploys on a mission will come back with a merit-based award. Pretty much, they are all written up. They are going to come back with a Bronze Star Medal, a Joint Commendation Medal, or something, which certainly is not our practice here. But you look at other countries, and you look at the French Légion d'honneur, and although it can be for a single act of great bravery, if you're a colonel and you become commander of, I think, as a corps, and you don't have it already, you get it automatically. So on the one hand, it can be an automatic award. It can be long distinguished, like leadership, or a bit like ROMM, and an act of bravery. So it's, every country's got their traditions and practices. We can't really say that one is better than the other. It's just more in line with our own culture and background. I wouldn't say that the American system is bad. It's simply different, and it fits their needs, and they have respect for it, and they take it very seriously, as we do ours. And that's all it is. Sometimes we don't want to compare and say that we ought to do more like others or to be completely different than others. We take the good ideas and emulate them, and avoid what we find may not be the best solutions. But the systems are different, and we have to respect them for what they are, and they are an image of the culture that they come from. If you look at the old Soviet system, where they awarded medals for mothers of many children, and the Germans did the same thing too. If you got 5 kids, you get a bronze one. If you get 6 or 7 kids, you get a silver one. If you get 8 kids or more, you get the gold one. Well, that's great when you want to create kids, to send to the battlefield for Hitler or Stalin. Not the type of thing that would fly in Canada, I don't think. So again, it's the honors and the values that you want to promote are a representation or an illustration of the society that they come from. And so that's why they're all so different. But, they're not necessarily better or worse than ours.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, this will be the very last question from Fraser McKee. Is it intended to change the crown format on the crosses from the Edward when Charles presumably becomes king? To change
yes, well, that's more of a heraldry question than an honors one, but it is, there's a bit of confusion about the crown. Of course, there is only one St. Edward's crown, the one used for the coronation that was made in 1662, and that's the one that is depicted on our badges and insignia and all of that. The way it is depicted has changed over time. There was no real standard for a long while, but in heraldry, traditionally, a royal crown has, curved arches with what we call the orb, which represents the globe with a cross on it, being in a valley. When an imperial crown usually has the orb and cross sitting on a mountain where the arches are curved up. So when Queen Victoria was made Empress of India in 1877, at the initiative of Prime Minister Disraeli, gradually, but not systematically, the depiction of St. Edward's crown start to show more imperial style arches. But again, this was not systematic. You still had various shapes, and there was not one standard. When King Edward VII came to the throne in 1902, he decided there would be one standard depiction of the crown. And of course, he was Emperor of India, and so they adopted the imperial shape of depiction, which continued throughout while the empire continued until 1947, when India, parted the empire, and the king was no longer Emperor of India. They changed the motto of the legend of the king on medals and coins, but they did not change the crown mid-reign, because changing all of the buttons and medals and all, it would have been too much. But when, of course, the queen ascended the throne, we returned to a more royal, i.e. the orb in the valley, form of crown officially. So to say one was the king's crown, one was the queen's crown, is a bit of a misnomer, because if you look back at George I, II, III, William, they all had royal crowns with bombed arches. We got stuck with this queen's crown and king's crown because of the accession in 52, after which it was decided to return, and it was from a king to a queen incidentally. But if it had been a king still, I think the same change would have been made, because we had lost India in 47, and this was the occasion to change it back. All of this to say that the next sovereign will not be an emperor, it will still be king, and therefore I do not believe, although this is a personal choice of the sovereign, he could decide to make it pink if he wanted to, but I think the crown will remain unchanged. That's just me.
Well, thank you very much, Carl, for a most eloquent and outstanding presentation on Canadian military honors and recognition. And you've made it far more understandable of this very complex system. Thank you once again. And thank you, Tom, for suggesting Carl for the presentation. At this time, I usually present our speaker with a gift from RCMI and appreciation. But due to these uncertain times, I cannot do it. Therefore, Carl, keep an eye out for your post box for Canada Post to do the job for me.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.